Imagine it. The year is 1901. Queen Victoria has passed away. Winston Churchill makes his very first speech at the House of Commons. Picasso holds his very first art exhibition in Paris at the age of 19. And Australia gets its very first parliament. Stateside, New York is the first state to require a license plate on your automobile. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid rob a train in Montana of $40,000, which would be about $1.2 million today. And finally, the man who popularized the phrase, "speak softly and carry a big stick," is inaugurated. The now former vice president takes the oath of office in Buffalo, New York, shortly after the assassination of President McKinley. That makes Theodore Roosevelt the youngest president to ever hold office, still to this day, at the age of 42. And it actually made a lot of the Republican Party nervous because Theodore was a little bit on the liberal side of things. In fact, he was only nominated as vice president to kind of keep him in a sort of powerless position. He was very popular, and they kind of didn't like the way he was going. So this was a little nerve-wracking time for a lot of the party. About a month into his presidency, Roosevelt invites Booker T. Washington to have a chat in Washington, D.C. with him. Here you can see them together. 2 months into his presidency, he signs a treaty with the British that give us more or less control of the area that will be the Panama Canal. And while we're gaining access to a foreign area, we are denying Chinese laborers to gain access to the United States through the Philippines. Another year, another strike. In May of 1902, 140,000 coal miners walk off the job. On the bright side, the first national park created under Roosevelt takes place here at Crater Lake in Oregon. Over the course of Roosevelt's administration, 230 million acres become part of the national park system. That includes 150 national forests, 55 bird and game preserves, and 18 national monuments. Along with that progress, Roosevelt signs the Newlands Reclamation Act in June. This opens the door to federal irrigation projects. A couple of weeks later, the Philippine Act is signed, which essentially calls the Philippine Islands territory, and that people who live there are territorial citizens. By October, the strike is still going on, and it's making people quite nervous because it's about to start getting nippy. And so Roosevelt is done playing around. So he invites the union leaders and some of the workers together to hash this out. And he wants a resolution. This is called the Square Deal. The strike ends by the 21st. On Valentine's Day of 1903, the Department of Commerce and Labor was created. A month later, Pelican Island becomes the very first federal bird reservation. In November, a revolt starts in Panama, and it's against the Colombian rule. Funny enough, the U.S. supports this, and while they support it, they have a navy there in Panama. And so this keeps Colombia from doing anything about the revolt. And 3 days later, the U.S. formally recognizes the Republic of Panama. Less than 2 weeks later, the U.S. and Panama have a treaty where we are given a 10-mile radius around the Panama Canal. Of course, that comes with us paying Panama $10 million plus an annual fee of $250,000. Starting off in 1904, the Supreme Court rules that Puerto Rican citizens are not citizens of the U.S., but they cannot be denied entry into the U.S. And remember the Sherman Antitrust Act? Well, Roosevelt is here to mean business. And when it comes to breaking up monopolies, which is what the act was for, he gets started with the National Security Act, which is forced to break up. In November, Roosevelt wins re-election by a landslide. He earns 336 electoral votes versus his competitor, who is getting like 140. Roosevelt vows that this is his last term. We'll learn more about that later. Part of Roosevelt's message to Congress a month later is the Roosevelt Corollary, which is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine says that part of it says that we're not supposed to get involved with anything going on in Western Europe. Well, Roosevelt adds to that, unless there's sufficient cause to get involved. In fact, it would be America's duty to get involved under those circumstances. So conveniently, the following month, the Dominican Republic needs help with its European creditors. So naturally, that is one of those extenuating circumstances that we have to get involved in. February 1st, 1905, Roosevelt establishes the National Forest Service. Around that time, the Niagara movement is being formed by black intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's to fight racial inequality. This will be the start of what will become the NAACP a few years later. Once again feeling the need to get involved in international affairs, Roosevelt helps mediate the war between Russia and Japan. For his efforts, he invites them to talk in New Hampshire, of all places. For his efforts, he is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize next year. Still feeling pretty confident in January of 1906, Roosevelt helps mediate another conflict going on between Germany and France over who is in Morocco. Back in the States, Brownsville, Texas to be exact, there are some local white people who are harassing some of the black soldiers, and 3 of the taunters of the soldiers are killed. Before the rest of the U.S. can get an understanding about what was going on in Texas, San Francisco has an enormous earthquake in 1906 that levels 490 blocks worth of area, and 450 people are killed. In June, the president signs the National Monument Act, officially declaring 18 spots national monuments. Unfortunately, more race-related violence is going on in my hometown in Atlanta, as you can see right here. This is a French newspaper, and so this is such a big deal. They're talking about it everywhere. During this September riot, 21 people lose their lives, including 18 African Americans. A week later, the U.S. military is given control of Cuba. And then Taft, William Taft, a name we'll hear again, is made governor. And with all of his involvement internationally, it shouldn't be surprising that Theodore Roosevelt is the first sitting president to take a trip abroad, and he goes to Panama to check out progress on the canal. The Immigration Act of 1907 is signed, and essentially it's restricting Japanese from coming over, more specifically Japanese workers. And the reason is Roosevelt felt that some of the international workers, particularly Japanese workers, were being coerced to come into the United States. So this was his way of keeping them from coming against their will by forbidding them to come at all. This is the Great White Fleet that sets out from Virginia and is gone for 2 years, showing off America's Navy. It makes it all the way to Japan and China. Roosevelt hosting a conservation conference in D.C. Tune in next time when the only person to be both president and Chief Justice is inaugurated.